The moment I walked out onto my porch that morning and saw three complete strangers loudly arguing over the price of my living room furniture as if they were haggling at some roadside market, my brain refused to process what my eyes were showing me, and for a terrifying, hilarious, heartbreaking, confusing 10-second window, I kept blinking like a malfunctioning streetlight because nothing made sense, absolutely nothing, until one of them waved a printed paper in my face and said, "Congratulations. Your place is sold," and for a moment my heart felt like it fell through the floor and bounced back up with a slap, because I knew instantly that only one person on planet Earth was capable of creating this kind of disaster before breakfast: the unstoppable chaos engine known as HOA Karen, the same woman who once filed a complaint because my trees had the audacity to grow leaves during her pool party, and now apparently she had taken it upon herself to fake a deed and sell my home like it was some discount sofa at a clearance warehouse. I stood there frozen with a mug of coffee that no longer knew whether it wanted to exist or not, staring at the strangers measuring my walls, while one of them excitedly talked about knocking down my kitchen to build a yoga meditation nook. And as my mind scrambled between hysterical laughter and pure horror, I finally snapped back into my body and marched forward, demanding who exactly told them this house was for sale and why they were inside without permission, but they innocently insisted that the seller, a woman named Karen Parker from the Homeowners Association, had given them full rights to do an early walk-through, and that they had even paid her a deposit. I felt the heat rise in my neck as reality unfolded like a slow-moving nightmare, and I tried calling Karen, but of course she didn't pick up because villains never answer the phone during the first act, so I hustled the confused buyers out the door and stepped outside only to see Karen herself strutting across the lawn like she was the queen of the subdivision, holding a clipboard like it was a royal scepter, and the proud smugness on her face was so bright it could probably be used as an emergency lighthouse signal. I stormed toward her demanding an explanation, but she dramatically pretended not to hear me the same way she pretended not to see her dog leaving spectacular landmines on every neighbor's lawn, and she started rambling loudly about how she finally saved the neighborhood by removing me, the so-called problem homeowner who refused to repaint my fence every season just because she thought it was fading by half a shade. I kept telling her she can't sell a property that she doesn't own, that my name was literally on the deed she was waving around like a victory flag, but she shook the papers in my face, saying the association had voted me out and transferred property rights to her, which sounded so delusional I briefly wondered if she had eaten a scented candle for breakfast. I grabbed the paper and scanned it only to burst out laughing because the fake deed was so poorly made that my name was misspelled in 4 different ways, including one that looked like it belonged to a medieval wizard, yet the buyers had fallen for it because Karen had delivered her pitch with the confidence of a politician who forgot what truth is. I told her this was fraud on a scale even she hadn't reached before, but she smirked with the confidence of someone who thought she could win against gravity, telling me the sheriff was already on the way to enforce my removal because she had reported me as a trespasser inside my own home. And suddenly my stomach flipped because even though I knew the truth, the idea of the sheriff showing up to a fake deed war scared me more than I wanted to admit. 10 minutes, that's all she kept saying with her dramatic little finger raised like she was performing Shakespeare. 10 minutes until she would finally watch me dragged off my property and waved goodbye to my belongings like she was the star of a drama series no one asked for, and I swear she was enjoying every second of her imaginary triumph, even though her entire plan was held together with printer ink and delusion. I tried calling the sheriff's office myself, but they were already en route and couldn't discuss the situation over the phone, which made my nerves crawl because the last thing I needed was to get into a legal argument on my front lawn with Karen performing in the background like an over-caffeinated peacock. While we waited, she started rearranging her hair and practicing her victory face in my window reflection, as if preparing for a magazine cover shot titled "Woman Who Ruined Everything on Purpose," and as the minutes dragged by I paced across my porch trying to figure out how to prove ownership before things exploded. Karen meanwhile kept boasting to the buyers who had returned to watch the chaos like it was free entertainment, telling them that once I was hauled away they could start tearing down walls immediately, even though one of them politely asked if this was even legal anymore since I was clearly very alive and not planning to vacate. She rolled her eyes at them, claiming they didn't understand the power of the HOA and the authority she possessed, but inside I could see a flicker of panic, like she hadn't expected anyone to question her reality-bending explanation. I felt my anger simmer into a strange amusement as I watched her unravel slightly around the edges, but before I could say anything else we heard the crunch of gravel under tires, and Karen gasped dramatically as the sheriff's truck pulled up into the driveway like the opening scene of a showdown, and suddenly the entire mood shifted from absurd comedy to high-stakes confrontation, because now everything was poised to flip, and I tightened my grip on the fake deed, ready to unleash the truth. "You said..." When the sheriff stepped out of his truck with the kind of calm authority that could silence an entire storm, Karen instantly puffed up like a parade balloon ready to burst from excitement as she strutted forward waving her fake deed as if she had just uncovered a national conspiracy, and I watched her with a mixture of disbelief and fascination because only she could treat a law enforcement arrival like a red carpet event. She raised her voice before he even reached the driveway, shouting that she had finally solved the neighborhood problem and that the trespasser, meaning me, should be removed immediately, and she pointed at me with the exaggerated flair of someone presenting the final contestant in a game show nobody watched, while the sheriff slowly looked from her to me with an expression that hovered between confusion and exhaustion, as if he had already dealt with her many times before in his career. I approached him calmly, trying to keep the situation from exploding, and handed him the fake deed she had given the buyers, explaining that Karen had created this mess out of spite and ego, and that she did not, under any circumstances, have the authority to sell a property that wasn't hers. But Karen immediately cut me off, saying that I was lying and that she had the full backing of the HOA board, which, considering she was the board, the assistant, the secretary, the treasurer, and the complaint committee all rolled into one person, was not exactly a convincing argument. The sheriff told her to lower her voice and asked if she had any legal documentation aside from this printed sheet to prove her claim, and she eagerly shoved her clipboard into his hands, where she had attached a stack of papers that looked like they had been copied, recopied, and then aggressively attacked by a highlighter, none of which resembled actual legal documents but all of which she treated with holy reverence. He flipped through them slowly, pausing at the deed again, then stared at her with a look that said, "Please tell me this is a prank," but she kept insisting that the association had the right to seize and sell properties that didn't meet visual standards, proudly citing my fence, which she believed had faded into a color she called moist beige, which wasn't even a real color, but somehow she had convinced herself it violated community spirit. The sheriff sighed and asked to see my actual deed, and I practically sprinted into the house to grab the original, returning with the legal folder that contained all my verified documents, and the moment he laid them side by side the discrepancy was so obvious that even the buyers whispered awkwardly among themselves, realizing they had nearly fallen victim to perhaps the most poorly executed fraud in suburban history. Karen, refusing to accept defeat, started spinning around in circles, claiming that the sheriff wasn't reading her papers correctly and that my deed had been invalidated in a secret HOA meeting which she conducted alone in her living room last night, and at that point even the sheriff pinched the bridge of his nose as if trying to summon patience from another dimension. He asked her calmly if she understood that forging property documents was a serious felony and that selling a house for which she had zero ownership was punishable by law, and she began stuttering, switching between anger, tears, confident speeches, and even attempting to guilt-trip him by saying she had baked cookies for the department last Christmas, but he remained unmoved. The buyers stepped forward, asking what would happen to their deposit, and Karen instantly snapped at them, saying no refunds because they had wasted her valuable time, which caused them to recoil and look at each other as if they had just discovered they had invested in a sinking pirate ship captained by a raccoon wearing a crown. I told them they should definitely request a police report for fraud, and the sheriff agreed, pulling out a notebook to start documenting the events while asking Karen direct questions, each one tightening the noose around her imaginary authority until she began sputtering like a broken fountain. She tried blaming me, blaming neighborhood bylaws, blaming humidity for smudging her signatures, even claiming that the universe had chosen her as the rightful owner of my home, which made one buyer quietly ask if she needed medical assistance. As things escalated, the sheriff asked her one final time if she wanted to stick to her story or correct it before he filed charges, and instead of admitting fault she doubled down with a wild dramatic flourish announcing that the entire neighborhood would support her decision and that I was the villain destroying the harmony she had worked so hard to build through constant surveillance and unsolicited complaints. That was the exact moment every neighbor within earshot stepped outside, drawn by the chaos, and one by one they began explaining to the sheriff how Karen had terrorized everyone for years, listing her greatest hits such as writing citations for lawn chairs being slightly tilted, demanding monthly inspections of garage interiors, and forcing an elderly neighbor to repaint her shutters because the shade of blue offended her aura. The sheriff listened patiently and then turned back to Karen, whose face now flickered between shock, disbelief, and betrayal because she had always assumed the neighborhood adored her iron rule when in reality they were surviving it like a natural disaster they couldn't stop. She tried to recover by accusing them all of lying, but her voice wavered and cracked, and for the first time since I had known her she actually seemed unsure of herself, as if the reality of her collapsing empire finally struck her. The sheriff told her she needed to come sit in the truck while he sorted out the paperwork, and she began backing away, insisting that he didn't understand the importance of the HOA, but he calmly took her by the arm and guided her toward the vehicle, leaving her squawking like an outraged parrot at the unfairness of it all. The buyers apologized profusely to me and thanked the sheriff for stepping in, and as Karen sat in the truck still trying to negotiate her imaginary power, I felt a wave of satisfaction wash over me because the truth had finally caught up to her. But deep down I also knew Karen never surrendered easily, and something told me this was only the beginning of a much bigger storm she was about to unleash. As the sheriff finished securing Karen in the truck with the door open just enough to keep her supervised but not enough for her to bolt out like a raccoon escaping a trash can, he walked back toward me with a stack of written notes and a half-exhausted, half-amused expression. And I could already sense that Chapter 1 of our growing neighborhood saga was far from over, because the moment he started asking the buyers for details about the payment they had made to Karen, she immediately erupted. From the back seat yelling that everything was a misunderstanding and that she had merely collected an HOA processing fee which was so absurdly inaccurate that the sheriff paused mid-sentence just to stare at her in disbelief. The buyers explained that they had transferred the deposit digitally and even had a receipt which they showed him on their phone, and as he examined the transaction details Karen continued shouting that the funds were part of a community improvement project she had invented 2 days ago, but the sheriff shut her down with a firm enough tone to make her retreat into the seat like a toddler scolded for coloring on the walls. While he sorted through the paperwork, the neighbors began gathering in small clusters around the lawn, whispering animatedly, relieved that someone was finally addressing Karen's chaos, and soon the entire street felt like a block party hosted by frustration and gossip as everyone swapped stories about the most ridiculous citations she had ever issued, like the time she fined a family because their shadow on the sidewalk was too long during the afternoon, even though she insisted shadows must remain proportional. One elderly neighbor stepped forward telling the sheriff how Karen had once measured her hanging flower baskets with a tape measure and demanded they be raised 3 inches higher to maintain visual harmony, which still made no sense but had been enforced with terrifying dedication. Meanwhile I kept glancing at Karen, who alternated between angry muttering and dramatic sighs, clearly struggling to understand how her perfectly planned dictatorship had crumbled so quickly under actual legal scrutiny. The sheriff asked if I wanted to press charges, and while part of me wanted to toss the metaphorical book at her so hard it ricocheted into next week, another part hesitated because I knew that pushing her into a full legal corner might unleash something even more unpredictable. But before I could decide, the buyers asked if they could file a complaint because they wanted to recover their money and possibly pursue fraud charges, and the sheriff assured them that they had every right to, which made Karen snap again, insisting that she would refund them once her paperwork was validated. But the sheriff calmly reminded her that forging a deed wasn't something that magically validated itself, no matter how long she stared at it. Just when I thought the situation was beginning to settle into a predictable pattern, a white SUV with the HOA logo crudely taped on the door rolled up like a clown car missing half its parts, and out stepped two people who looked like they had been woken from a nap and forced into roles they didn't understand, claiming they were the HOA enforcement team, which was funny because everyone knew Karen was the entire enforcement team. They marched toward the sheriff demanding to know why the beloved HOA president was being detained, but the sheriff asked them for their identification and official authority, and they nervously explained that Karen had phoned them an hour earlier telling them to be on standby because she was about to execute a neighborhood rescue mission, so they assumed this was part of her grand plan. The sheriff looked at them with the same expression one uses when listening to a child explain how they built a flying machine out of cardboard, and he patiently told them that impersonating HOA officers as actual law enforcement could cause legal trouble, causing both of them to deflate on the spot as if realizing they had stumbled into a disaster they wanted no part in. Karen shouted insults at them for abandoning her, claiming they were weak and disloyal, but they quietly slipped back to their SUV and drove away as fast as possible, leaving her yelling into the distance like a villain whose minions had gone on strike. The sheriff shook his head and told me that he had enough evidence to file charges, but he wanted to ensure that the neighborhood would be safe from further disruptions while the investigation proceeded. He suggested issuing a restraining order to prevent Karen from stepping foot on my property until everything was resolved, and the idea filled me with such relief that I almost laughed, knowing that at least for a while I wouldn't have to worry about her barging onto my lawn with a clipboard full of imaginary rules. As he worked on the paperwork, the neighbors continued gathering, offering encouragement and sharing relief that someone was finally pushing back against the reign of HOA terror, but in the midst of their cheerful chatter one neighbor stepped closer to me and lowered his voice, saying that Karen had been bragging for months about having secret backup plans hidden in the HOA files. Plans she claimed would let her take ownership of properties she believed were blights on the community. At first I dismissed it as typical Karen exaggeration, but the thought lingered uncomfortably in my mind because Karen was exactly the type of person who would create a disaster binder full of illegal fantasies and treat it like a sacred relic. While the sheriff finished his forms, another problem arose when the buyers discovered that Karen had also given them a fake move-in schedule that included dates for renovation crews who were supposed to arrive the following week, meaning she had gone far deeper into her delusions than anyone realized. They asked if they could check her office located in the HOA clubhouse for more fraudulent paperwork, but the sheriff insisted that no one was to enter any HOA facility until a warrant was approved, and the mention of a clubhouse made several neighbors snicker because the clubhouse was actually Karen's garage, which she had decorated with cheap laminate flooring and a fake reception desk she bought online. The longer we waited, the more Karen spiraled inside the truck, alternating between screaming threats and crying apologies, then switching to elaborate stories about how she was trying to save the neighborhood from moral decay, which apparently included my choice of mailbox color. The sheriff eventually returned with the completed report and told me that they would be taking Karen in for questioning and processing, but that the situation might escalate depending on what other fraudulent activities were discovered once warrants were issued. As they prepared to transport her, she screamed that she would return stronger than ever, that the HOA would rise under her command, and that everyone would regret turning against her. But the sheriff simply nodded and shut the vehicle door, muffling her voice into a distant buzzing sound that echoed down the street as the truck pulled away. For a moment the neighborhood fell into a peaceful quiet I hadn't heard in years, and though I knew deep down that this fight was far from over, I couldn't deny the fragile sense of victory that settled over the lawn like a breath of fresh air after a long storm. "You said," Once the sheriff's truck carrying Karen finally disappeared around the corner and the neighborhood slowly returned to something that resembled normalcy, I allowed myself to exhale for the first time that day, but the moment my shoulders relaxed and I thought the worst had passed, 3 more neighbors hurried toward me with urgent expressions that sent a wave of unease crawling up my spine because nothing about their faces suggested peace, closure, or even relief but rather the unmistakable warning that a new disaster was already brewing. One of them, Mrs. Turner, the kind elderly woman who always baked cinnamon rolls for random occasions like Tuesday morning or nice weather, whispered that Karen had not just been forging deeds but had also been collecting signatures for something she referred to as the ultimate neighborhood reform plan, and she kept it locked inside her garage, which she insisted on calling the HOA headquarters even though it still smelled like paint thinner and old fertilizer. According to Mrs. Turner, Karen had bragged about having documents that would allow her to exert full control over multiple properties, including mine, through a loophole she claimed she had discovered in an old HOA handbook from the 1980s, which she thought was a legal goldmine but was more likely just outdated guidelines about recycling bins. The troubling part was that she had convinced several residents to sign documents without reading them by telling them it was for a community improvement initiative that included upgrading streetlights and repairing sidewalks, and some neighbors believed her because she had an uncanny ability to speak with confidence even while spewing nonsense. As more neighbors joined the conversation, it became clear that Karen had been operating a miniature empire of delusions with enough forged paperwork to start her own imaginary government, and as the realization settled in, I felt a mixture of anger and dread because her arrest might have been only the first domino in a much larger disaster. The neighbors suggested we inspect the clubhouse for clues, but I reminded them that the sheriff had clearly said we were not allowed to enter any HOA property until a warrant was issued, and though we all hated the idea of Karen keeping whatever chaos she stored inside, the last thing we needed was to accidentally turn the situation into a legal mess. So instead we returned to my porch and tried to piece together a timeline of Karen's madness, starting with the moment she became HOA president by default when everyone else refused to run for the position, which in hindsight was the equivalent of handing a toddler the keys to a bulldozer and hoping for the best. From there she escalated, creating new rules weekly, often based on personal preferences disguised as community standards, like the time she changed the lawn height requirement to exactly 3¼ inches and fined anyone whose grass dared to grow taller or shorter, resulting in half the street obsessing over tape measures like gardeners preparing for a national championship. The more we talked, the more we realized how thoroughly Karen had embedded herself into every corner of neighborhood life, controlling everything from mailbox decorations to holiday lights, and even attempting to regulate the number of children allowed to play outside at once, claiming excessive laughter disrupted her concentration. What worried me most wasn't the rules themselves but the possibility that she had created enough paperwork to make someone believe she truly had authority over properties, particularly those she disliked. That meant her fake deed might not have been a one-time stunt but part of a bigger scheme, and that thought hit me like a cold realization that the storm wasn't over but simply gathering strength. While discussing this, Mr. Harris, the retired mechanic who lived across the street, suddenly remembered something important and hurried back to his garage, returning with a crumpled flyer that Karen had slid under every door 2 months ago titled Future Transformations, promising improvements across the neighborhood and asking residents to sign the attached consent form. Most people had laughed at it because it was formatted like a kindergarten art project with clip art flowers and misspelled words, but a few had signed just to get her off their doorstep, unaware that the document might contain language that Karen believed gave her full community power. I studied the flyer carefully, and although the text was vague and filled with dramatic phrases about necessary evolution and revitalizing the neighborhood's weak links, there was a single sentence at the bottom that read, "By signing this document, you grant the HOA administrative authority over structural and ownership concerns," which was so dangerously broad that I almost felt dizzy reading it. If Karen had been collecting signatures for this, and if she had interpreted those signatures as consent to seize properties, she might believe she was legally untouchable, which meant her upcoming meltdown at the sheriff's office was only the beginning of her fight to prove her imaginary authority. As the sun began setting and the neighbors dispersed to their homes with a newfound fear of what else Karen might have done, I walked inside and brewed a cup of tea to calm my nerves, though the calm lasted only 3 minutes because I soon received a text message from an unknown number containing a single sentence: "The association will not tolerate betrayal." I felt a chill run down my spine because it sounded exactly like the kind of villain monologue Karen would send if she somehow managed to get access to a phone while being detained, and while part of me wanted to dismiss it as a prank or some automated number, something about the tone felt unmistakably familiar. I double-checked the number but couldn't connect it to anyone in the neighborhood, which only made things more unsettling. A few minutes later I received another message saying enforcement will commence shortly, and that pushed my anxiety halfway to the ceiling because the last thing I wanted was surprise visitors acting on Karen's behalf, especially since we had just seen 2 confused HOA volunteers appear out of nowhere. I stepped outside to check the street, and everything was quiet except for distant barking and the soft glow of porch lights, but the air felt charged as if the neighborhood was holding its breath. I considered calling the sheriff to report the messages, but I knew he was still dealing with the initial paperwork from earlier and that Karen was likely occupying most of his attention at the station. Besides, without concrete evidence there wasn't much he could do. So I decided to stay alert and lock my doors, convincing myself that Karen couldn't cause more trouble while in custody, though deep down I knew she had ways of stirring chaos even from behind bars. As midnight approached and the neighborhood finally slipped into silence, I sat by the window watching the shadows stretch across my lawn, aware that each passing hour brought me closer to whatever storm Karen was planning, because her downfall had never been quiet or graceful, and something told me that when she struck back, she would do it with the same dramatic flair she applied to everything else in her perfectly manicured kingdom of madness. By the time morning light crept across my windowsill I had barely slept, not because anything happened during the night but because everything felt too still, too silent, too wrong, as if the neighborhood was holding a collective breath, waiting for the next shockwave from Karen, whose ability to cause chaos had never relied on her physical presence, and that thought alone kept my nerves stretched thin. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the street for anything out of place, and it only took 5 seconds to spot the first sign that today was going to be worse than yesterday, because right at the end of my driveway stood 3 bright orange cones labeled HOA Emergency Zone in giant letters that looked like they were printed at a gas station printer, and beside them a laminated sign hung crookedly on a stake reading Property Status Under Review with a fake signature that looked suspiciously like someone had traced a celebrity autograph. My stomach dropped because Karen was still in custody, which meant someone else had placed them there, someone who believed they were acting under her authority, and that idea alone made a wave of dread sink into my bones. Before I could remove anything, 2 men I had never seen before walked toward me carrying clipboards and wearing matching polo shirts that read Neighborhood Corrective Team, which sounded like a group invented during a fever dream, and they introduced themselves with stiff voices as HOA compliance assistants temporarily appointed by the acting president of the association. When I asked who the acting president was, they answered without hesitation that it was Karen because she had sent out a digital memo reinstating herself mere hours after being taken away, and according to them she had delivered instructions for immediate property inspections to secure the community during her difficult time. I stared at them in disbelief, wondering how anyone could treat a late-night text from a detained woman as official policy, but they were fully convinced of their mission and asked if they could enter my home to verify ownership status and check for violations. I refused instantly, telling them they had no legal authority, but they insisted that failure to comply would result in an emergency citation and possible property suspension, whatever that was supposed to mean. When I asked to see their authorization, they handed me a printout of a message that was clearly typed by Karen from a phone with autocorrect turned off because half the words were misspelled, and the rest were written in dramatic sentences about restoring order and removing rebellious influences from the neighborhood. I pointed out that none of it was official or legal, but they seemed unfazed, saying they trusted the vision of the association and believed Karen was a misunderstood leader facing unjust scrutiny. I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time because I could practically feel my sanity wobbling as these grown adults defended a woman who forged a deed using the wrong font and mismatched signatures, but their seriousness made everything even more surreal. As they argued with me, several neighbors began gathering with worried looks and whispered warnings that more of Karen's loyal supporters were roaming the neighborhood armed with clipboards and yardsticks measuring random things like fence heights, porch lights, and even the distance between lawn chairs. It was as if her arrest had activated a sleeper army of followers who believed they were carrying out a noble mission, and that possibility filled me with a cold sense of panic because I had never imagined anyone would take her nonsense seriously enough to act on it without her physically present. Before things escalated further, a police cruiser turned the corner and approached slowly, and both compliance assistants straightened their posture like schoolchildren caught misbehaving. The officer stepped out and approached me, asking if I had reported any disturbances, and I explained everything, including the cones, the fake inspection team, and the mysterious messages from last night. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if he had been dealing with Karen's ripple effect since sunrise, and told me that ever since her detainment she had been making phone calls to random numbers, issuing commands, and declaring that the neighborhood was under siege by non-compliant residents, and somehow a few people had believed her enough to start acting on her instructions. The officer shook his head and informed the compliance assistants that they were interfering with an active investigation and could be charged if they continued, which caused them to turn pale and instantly abandon their clipboards before speed, walking away like two embarrassed penguins fleeing a crime scene. The officer then removed the cones and the sign, tossing them into his trunk while muttering about needing 10 more people on duty just to deal with Karen's trail of confusion. He also told me that Karen had attempted to file a complaint from the holding area claiming she had been unlawfully dethroned and that her citizens were rising in protest, and although the department dismissed her claims as nonsensical, they were concerned about how many residents might still be influenced. As he spoke, another neighbor, Mr. Jensen, hurried toward us with panic in his eyes and a folder in his hands, explaining that he had found papers slipped under his door during the night. Papers that declared his property under HOA reclamation due to moral negligence, which was so vague and ridiculous that even the officer blinked twice in disbelief before asking to see it. The document was clearly another one of Karen's creations, filled with dramatic language and threats of forced removal, and I could tell the officer was growing more concerned as he realized Karen had likely distributed dozens of these forms long before her arrest and that some residents might still believe them valid. The officer reassured us that legal steps were being taken to suspend all HOA activities until the investigation concluded, and that the department planned to collect every piece of paperwork Karen had ever issued or forged, but that process would take time. As he headed back to his car, he warned me to remain cautious because Karen had tried to contact several people from detention and seemed determined to continue running the HOA remotely, which was absurd but frighteningly consistent with her stubbornness. After he left, I gathered the neighbors on my porch to discuss what we might be facing, and the more we talked the clearer it became that Karen's influence had stretched far wider than any of us realized. Some residents had signed documents believing they were harmless community forms, others had ignored her but now worried about what paperwork she might have forged using their names, and a few admitted they had gone along with her just to avoid becoming targets. It was a tangled mess of fear, manipulation, and blind trust that Karen had cultivated like a bizarre fan club built on threats and fake legal jargon. As the day wore on and more people shared their stories, I felt a growing sense of responsibility settle on my shoulders, not because I wanted to lead anything but because I had become the unwilling center of Karen's madness. If I didn't help untangle this mess, she might regain support the moment she walked free, and the neighborhood could fall right back into her chaotic rule. That thought made me realize that this battle wasn't just about proving a forged deed anymore. It was about dismantling whatever imaginary kingdom she had built before she had the chance to rise from the ashes and strike back harder than before. By the following afternoon the neighborhood felt like a war zone disguised as suburbia because every conversation, every whisper, every nervous glance toward the HOA clubhouse Karen's garage-turned-empire carried the tension of a community waiting for the next explosion of nonsense, and despite the police removing the cones and warning off the self-appointed compliance assistants, a lingering feeling remained that Karen had laid the groundwork for something much bigger, something she fully intended to activate the moment she regained even a sliver of freedom. I tried to keep myself occupied by checking the security cameras around my property, and that was when I noticed something strange in the footage from just after midnight. A shadowy figure had approached my front steps, crouched down, and slipped an envelope under my door before disappearing into the darkness. I had been awake at that hour and must have missed the sound completely, but curiosity gnawed at me until I finally retrieved the envelope from where I had left it on the entry table, opening it slowly as if expecting it to hiss or explode, and what I found inside made my stomach twist. It was a handwritten letter on fancy paper covered with flowery printed borders, and the message was written in Karen's dramatic cursive that resembled the handwriting of someone who desperately wanted to be a royal scribe. The letter stated that I had been selected for mandatory community reformation due to ongoing violations against neighborhood harmony, and I was instructed to report to the HOA clubhouse for a compliance hearing on the night she returned from her supposed administrative leave. The absurdity of calling her arrest administrative leave would have been hilarious if it didn't carry an edge of menace, because the letter clearly implied she expected to return soon and that she planned to host a full-scale tribunal involving anyone she considered disruptive. I felt a chill seep into my bones because this was no longer petty harassment. It was a coordinated attempt to build an authoritarian spectacle using fear, paperwork, and delusion as weapons. I took the letter outside to show my neighbors, and their reactions ranged from disbelief to exhausted resignation because many of them confessed that similar letters had also been slipped under their doors. Some residents had received warnings about architectural deviance, others about landscaping crimes, and one poor man named Carlos had been cited for cosmic disharmony because his wind chimes made a sound Karen claimed interfered with her spiritual equilibrium. While we compared letters and tried to understand how deep her influence had burrowed, one neighbor, a quiet woman named Dina who rarely participated in neighborhood drama, revealed something startling. She confessed that 2 weeks earlier Karen had approached her in secret and asked her to join a special HOA advisory council, claiming that she needed loyal members to help preserve order in case the community faced rebellion or sabotage. Dina had refused politely, thinking it was just another one of Karen's dramatic fantasies, but now she feared that Karen had actually formed such a council with those who were more easily manipulated. That revelation hit all of us hard because it meant that Karen's power wasn't just based on threats and paperwork. She had actually begun surrounding herself with people willing to follow her, whether out of fear, loyalty, or sheer boredom. Before we could process this further, a police cruiser returned to the neighborhood, and the same officer from the previous day stepped out with a tight expression on his face. He called me over, then looked around before explaining quietly that Karen had been released pending further investigation because the system required more time to process the fraud charges and verify all the forged documents. My blood ran cold at the thought of her returning, even temporarily, but before panic could take hold he continued, saying she wasn't allowed to set foot on my property or contact me directly according to the emergency restraining order. The problem, he explained, was that she could still speak with neighbors, manipulate them, or send out misleading instructions unless the community collectively stopped enabling her. The officer warned that she had already attempted to call several people claiming she had been vindicated and that law enforcement had apologized for the misunderstanding, and one resident even believed her, arriving at the station demanding her immediate reinstatement as HOA president. Hearing this made my head ache, Not because it was shocking, but because it was exactly the kind of absurd loyalty Karen thrived on. The officer encouraged us to stay alert and document everything she attempted to do upon returning, and promised they were working on obtaining warrants to fully search the clubhouse and confiscate any fraudulent material she stored there. After he left, a heavy silence settled among us as the reality of what was coming tightened like a knot around the community. Karen would return, and when she did, she would unleash her full force of delusional authority, backed by anyone foolish enough to believe her invented laws. As afternoon slid into evening, neighbors spread the word, forming informal groups to watch for any suspicious activity. I set cameras to record every angle of my property, and several residents volunteered to stay on alert in case Karen tried slipping more letters around the neighborhood. But the real storm arrived just after sunset, when a black sedan slowly rolled into the cul-de-sac and parked directly in front of the clubhouse. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a figure we recognized instantly even in the dim streetlight, her posture upright, her expression triumphant, and her hair styled with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for courtroom victories or reality show reunions. Karen had returned. She stood beside the car as if expecting applause, adjusting her blazer and flipping through a stack of papers like an actress preparing for her starring role. Then she walked toward her garage with slow, confident steps, opened the door with a flourish and switched on the lights, revealing what looked like a makeshift command center complete with filing cabinets, charts taped to walls, white boards covered in chaotic handwriting, and a podium she had definitely not owned last week. With a booming voice that echoed down the street, she announced that the HOA tribunal would convene at dawn and that all residents would be required to attend, claiming that those who refused would face immediate property reassessment. Several neighbors gasped, a few muttered curses, and one person whispered that she looked like she was about to declare martial law. I remained still, watching from my porch as Karen basked in her own spotlight, convinced that the universe had bent in her favor. She spoke about reclaiming the neighborhood's dignity, restoring order, and removing dangerous influences, all while completely ignoring the fact that she herself was under investigation. It was painfully clear that she saw her arrest not as a setback, but as a temporary inconvenience in her reign, and she was ready to fight harder than ever. As she continued her speech, I realized with growing dread that this showdown would not end quietly, and that tomorrow would be the day her illusions collided with reality in a way neither she nor the community would be able to escape. The entire neighborhood barely slept that night because everyone knew dawn would bring something none of us were prepared for, and as the first pale light crept across the rooftops I could already hear movement near the so-called clubhouse where Karen had spent the night preparing for what she clearly believed was the most important moment of her life, the grand tribunal where she intended to reclaim control, punish those who opposed her, and reinstate herself as queen of the cul-de-sac despite having no authority, no legal standing, and no grasp of reality. When I stepped outside, the morning air was thick with tension as clusters of sleepy, irritated neighbors slowly emerged from their homes, exchanging worried glances and half-whispered questions about what insanity awaited us, and when we approached the clubhouse the sight that greeted us was equal parts terrifying, comedic, and deeply confusing because Karen had transformed her garage into a fully decorated courtroom complete with folding chairs arranged in uneven rows, a hand-painted banner that said Neighborhood Justice in bright red letters, and a podium draped with fabric that looked suspiciously like her old dining room tablecloth. She stood behind the podium with the posture of someone preparing to deliver a presidential address, wearing a navy blazer one size too small and holding a wooden spoon she was pretending was a gavel, tapping it repeatedly against the podium as if she expected us to rise in respectful silence. Several neighbors exchanged looks that screamed, "Is she serious?" while others stared at the scene with open-mouthed disbelief, and before anyone could question her, Karen slammed the spoon again and announced that the tribunal was officially in session. She began reading from a long scroll of paper that nearly dragged on the floor, listing supposed crimes committed by residents such as visual rebellion, lawn tone inconsistency, disruptive mailbox choices, suspicious fence angles, unapproved solar lighting, and the gravest offense in her eyes, continued defiance against HOA supremacy. She then pointed directly at me with the dramatic flair of a stage actor and declared that I would be the first to stand trial for destabilizing the harmony of the community, nearly selling out the HOA board by refusing to accept her authority, and provoking local law enforcement with malicious intent. The absurdity was so overwhelming that for a moment I truly wondered if I was still dreaming, but the cold morning air and the sight of Karen waving her wooden spoon like a judge lost in a cooking show grounded me back into the nightmare reality. I stepped forward preparing to speak, but before I could say a word, the garage door behind her suddenly flew open with a loud metallic crash, causing everyone to jump as two police officers stepped inside demanding to know what exactly was happening and why Karen was attempting to conduct a legal proceeding on private property without authorization. Karen spun around with a gasp, clutching her scroll to her chest and insisting this was an official hearing sanctioned by the HOA Constitution, but the officers informed her yet again that the HOA had been temporarily suspended under investigation and that any attempt to enforce rules, hold hearings, or intimidate residents would be considered a violation of her restraining order and an attempt to obstruct an active investigation. She argued, of course, claiming that she wasn't intimidating anyone but merely guiding the neighborhood through a dark and dangerous time caused by subversive forces, meaning me, and that the tribunal was her moral obligation to the people, but the officers remained unimpressed. Before they could remove her, however, something completely unexpected happened. One of her loyal followers, a tall man named Brent who had always believed every word she said, suddenly stepped forward with his clipboard raised like a shield and declared that the community deserved justice and that the officers had no right to interfere in HOA matters. His outburst seemed to embolden the few remaining loyalists scattered in the crowd, and within seconds about 5 of them formed a loose line behind Karen, chanting "Protect the HOA" in low, uncertain voices that echoed around the cul-de-sac with the enthusiasm of a group auditioning for a choir they didn't want to join. The officers looked baffled as Karen raised her spoon triumphantly, emboldened by this miniature rebellion, and she shouted that the people had spoken and that law enforcement must acknowledge the authority of the HOA Council. But before she could continue her monologue, the officers calmly reminded her that she was violating her restraining order by addressing me directly and by organizing any form of group action, which caused the crowd of neighbors to gasp, because violating a restraining order meant immediate consequences. Karen froze for a moment, her expression shifting from triumph to panic, but instead of surrendering she launched into one final dramatic speech about fighting tyranny and protecting suburban order, raising the spoon high above her head like a warrior preparing to charge. Unfortunately for her, she swung it too enthusiastically, losing her grip and sending the spoon flying across the garage where it bounced off a filing cabinet and hit one of her followers squarely on the forehead, causing the man to yelp and clutch his head while the other loyalists immediately broke formation and backed away from her. The officers wasted no time stepping forward to detain her once again, and as they took her by the arms she tried to twist free, shouting that the tribunal wasn't over and that the neighborhood would crumble without her leadership, but her voice grew muffled as they guided her out of the garage toward the cruiser waiting outside. Neighbors began murmuring with relief while a few shook their heads at the sheer madness of the morning, but just as everyone thought the ordeal was done, one final twist emerged. The officers informed us that during their early morning search of the HOA clubhouse they had discovered a hidden drawer filled with forged documents, fabricated signatures, blank forms ready to be altered, and a handwritten plan titled Phase 2 Neighborhood Reclamation, which outlined her intention to declare certain properties abandoned, reassign them to herself, and force residents into compliance training sessions. The crowd erupted with shocked whispers as the officers explained that these documents were now part of a major investigation that could escalate Karen's charges significantly. As the cruiser drove away with Karen still yelling about restoring order, the weight of everything that had happened settled over the neighborhood like a storm cloud finally breaking apart, and for the first time since the chaos began, I felt something that resembled genuine relief. The tribunal had failed, the loyalists had scattered, the clubhouse was now under legal control, and Karen was facing charges she could no longer dodge with confidence or delusion. But even as the neighbors began to disperse, exchanging tired but relieved smiles, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fallout from her reign wasn't over yet, and that the investigation into her files would reveal secrets none of us were prepared to face, making it clear that although the storm had broken, its aftermath was only beginning. When the police cruiser carrying Karen vanished down the street for the second time in 2 days, the neighborhood felt suspended in a strange quiet, the kind that comes only after a storm so chaotic and unbelievable that people aren't sure whether to celebrate or prepare for the next wave. And as residents began drifting back to their homes with exhausted relief, it became clear that even though her tribunal was over, the consequences of everything she had done were just beginning to unravel like a tightly wound thread snapping loose from every direction at once. I lingered near the clubhouse with a few neighbors as officers sealed the area, watching them carry out boxes filled with Karen's secret files, binders, folders, and loose papers covered in frantic handwriting that looked more like the ramblings of someone plotting a reality show coup than managing a neighborhood, and every time they opened another drawer or cabinet they seemed to find something stranger than the last. One officer showed me a binder labeled Contingency Operations, filled with outrageous plans including forced yard inspections at dawn, mandatory morale training for residents who annoyed her, and something she called fence rehabilitation for anyone whose property she found aesthetically disappointing. As ridiculous as it all sounded, seeing these ideas written, dated, and categorized with obsessive detail made my stomach churn because it meant this wasn't improvisation or impulsive madness. It was a long-term scheme she had designed meticulously, believing it would someday become law. Another officer approached holding a stack of envelopes, explaining that these were scheduled to be delivered next week as Phase 2 warnings, each containing fabricated violations and threats of property seizure, and I was horrified to see my name on at least 5 of them, each more dramatic and ridiculous than the last. One even accused me of orchestrating a conspiracy to overthrow the HOA using psychological warfare, though how leaving my trash cans out for an extra hour qualified as psychological warfare was beyond comprehension. As we were absorbing all this, a loud commotion erupted down the street, drawing everyone's attention to a silver truck speeding toward us, and before anyone could react the truck screeched to a halt beside the clubhouse, the door flew open, and out stepped a tall, irritated-looking woman with a stack of legal folders under one arm and fury glowing in her eyes. She introduced herself as Karen's sister, Laura, and announced that she had come to get her siblings' belongings because she had received a phone call claiming the neighborhood had unjustly staged a coup against her. The officers exchanged weary looks as they explained the situation calmly, detailing the forgery, the fraudulent transactions, the fake tribunal, and the mountain of incriminating documents found inside the clubhouse, and with each revelation Laura's expression transitioned slowly from anger to disbelief to mortified resignation. Finally she sighed deeply and rubbed her temples, apologizing repeatedly for her sister's behavior and admitting that this wasn't the first time Karen had spiraled into obsessive control fantasies, though this was by far the worst and most public. She confessed that their family had tried for years to get her help, but Karen always insisted she was perfectly fine and that everyone else just couldn't appreciate her visionary leadership. Several neighbors nodded sympathetically, though a few muttered that visionary was not exactly the word they would use. As Laura began gathering the more innocent of Karen's belongings like personal notebooks and spare glasses, she paused when she came across a small safe hidden behind a stack of fake legal binders, and at the officer's request she opened it, revealing a collection of items so bizarre it left everyone speechless for a moment. Inside were dozens of laminated cards labeled with residents' names and assigned roles such as loyal supporter, potential threat, silent observer, and rebellion risk, along with color-coded stickers she apparently planned to distribute to categorize people during future HOA drills. There was even a drafted schedule for something called Property Purification Day, which sounded less like a neighborhood event and more like the plot of a dystopian novel. Laura shook her head in embarrassment as the officers documented everything, and she admitted quietly that Karen's obsession with control had grown worse after she became HOA president, feeding a part of her personality that couldn't distinguish between leadership and dominance. Once the clubhouse was fully cleared and sealed, the officers turned to us and explained what would happen next. All HOA power was suspended indefinitely, a temporary management committee would be formed from volunteer residents, and all fraudulent documents would be destroyed after being catalogued as evidence. Residents who had unknowingly signed anything would be legally protected, and the neighborhood would function without HOA interference until a stable structure could be rebuilt. As the officers left, neighbors slowly gathered in a circle near my lawn, sharing an exhausted but victorious moment of unity. For the first time in years, no one was afraid of receiving a citation for breathing incorrectly, no one was worried about mailbox-style violations, and no one felt watched from behind lace curtains while trimming their hedges. A few neighbors even joked about throwing a block party titled Freedom from Tyranny, though everyone agreed they needed at least a week of sleep before planning anything festive. As the crowd dispersed, Laura approached me with a small box in her hands, saying she had found something addressed specifically to me in Karen's handwriting. My nerves spiked as I opened the box, half expecting more threats, but inside was something surprisingly strange and almost sad. It was a small model of the neighborhood, made from cardboard and popsicle sticks, meticulously crafted with tiny houses, roads, and paper trees. But what stood out was the center where Karen's house sat twice as large as the others, surrounded by miniature signs that read Leadership Headquarters, Command Center, and Visionary Zone. My house, on the other hand, was marked with a red X and labeled Disciplinary Region. Laura watched my reaction quietly before saying that Karen always needed to feel important, needed to feel in control, and that somewhere along the line she had lost her ability to see where leadership ended and obsession began. I nodded slowly, realizing that beneath all the madness and chaos there was a person who had built her identity on authority so desperately that she created entire worlds inside her head to maintain it. After Laura drove away, promising to update us once she knew more about Karen's legal situation, I returned to my porch where the afternoon light cast long shadows across the street. The neighborhood felt lighter, freer, almost reborn in a way, yet a lingering sadness settled in my chest because despite everything she had done, there was something profoundly tragic about watching a person build a kingdom out of paper and panic, only to see it crumble under the weight of its own delusion. Still, as I looked around at the relieved faces of neighbors walking their dogs, watering their plants, and chatting without fear, I knew this was a turning point, a moment the community would remember for years. And as I finally stepped inside my home, closing the door behind me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in ages, I allowed myself to believe that the chaos was truly over. The forged deed, the attempted sale of my home, the tribunal, the rebellion, the schemes, the sleepless nights, all of it had led to this moment where the neighborhood finally reclaimed its sanity, leaving Karen to face the consequences of the empire she built and destroyed with her own hands.